All right, so we're going to go ahead and start chapter 1. Chapter 1 is broken down into 3 I can statements. So on your test, you'll log in and there'll be section like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And the first thing that we're going to do is to learn to basically take algebra and make it into words, and then take words and make it into algebra. And we have to be able to go back and forth. And this chapter, chapter 1, is not like most of the rest of the class. So if you're not a big fan of reading or you're intimidated by the words, just know that this is just kind of like the start, and it's not, the rest of the class isn't this way. So what I always like to do when we start this chapter is to read the I can statement and make sure that you understand what it is that I'm going to ask you to be able to demonstrate. So it says, I understand that quantitative, meaning numbers, real-world situations can be represented as algebraic expressions. And so these are 2 examples, and these are examples that you could see on the test. These may even happen to have come from the test. First one is 2 less than the difference of 7 and the square root of a number. And the second says, John has 3 more than twice as much money as Susan. If Susan has $D, write an expression for how much John has. We're going to do a couple different IXL modules. One of them is going to be I1, and the other one is going to be A5, and that's like one of the very few that's in a different section of IXL. This one happens to be in geometry. So, way that we're going to start this is we are actually going to start with this graphic organizer, which we're going to use to basically fill in all the English words that we know that mean the 4 operations. I always say to my students, it doesn't matter if you're in Algebra 1, or if you're in 4th grade math, or if you're in calculus, or if you're in any other math class that you could take. There's only 4 things that we're allowed to do with numbers. And those 4 things are add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So those are the only 4 things we can do with numbers. And we actually have a lot of different English words that mean those things. So when we go to the grocery store and we buy a bunch of items, we put them all in our cart, and then we get up to the front at the cash register, and the first thing that they do is they start to scan them, and we look at the total and how much we're going to pay, and they sum the cost of all those items. They take all those and they add them up. They're basically doing addition with the cost of all those items. So we would say the word add. Whenever I say the word sum, in order to sum something, we have to have at least 2 things to add together. Sometimes we use the phrase more than. We actually just saw that. So if I have more than you, I would take however much you have, and I would add however many more I have, and that's how I would get to the total number I have. We have lots of different words for the operation subtraction. So some of the words that we have are difference. That's the one way of saying the distance between 2 numbers is the difference. We have the word less, which simply means to subtract. We have minus, which is often what we call the subtraction for the symbol for subtraction. We have deduct. Make sure I spell that right. We have decrease, or decreased by. So decrease or decrease by. We have diminished. And we also have one that I always like to draw an arrow for, and that's less than. And whenever we have this less than, I draw an arrow from the front to the back, because that's one that we're going to change the order for. When we say diminish by and decrease by, that actually gives me a few more that I can add up here under addition. So we could have increased by. We could have the word plus, which is often what we say when we see the symbol for addition. We often say plus for that. We could even say gain. And we could even change add to added to. And this is not an exhaustive list. There's lots of other words that we could also say. I think I missed one for difference here. We could also say take away. Moving on to multiplication. There aren't as many words for multiplication and division, but I do want to make sure that we get most of these. I'm looking at a list here. So for multiplication, I think the one that we should just start off with the obvious one, which is to multiply. Sometimes we hear times. I try to encourage students to say multiply instead of times, but I think we all use it interchangeably. This is one that students often want to put into the addition category, but product means to multiply. We also have a few special case multiplications. So if you are hungry and you go to a fast food restaurant and instead of ordering a normal cheeseburger, you get a double cheeseburger, well, that's just multiplied by 2. So we put times 2. And if you're really hungry and maybe you go to like a Burger King or a place that has burgers, or maybe like a Hardee's that has multiple options, you could get a triple burger, which would be times 3. And one thing is, I'm using the dot here, and most of the time when we see multiplication, we see it in lower grades, we think of multiplication with an x. But now we're in algebra, and when we are in algebra, we cannot use x because we're going to learn that x is used to represent a variable. We have some other ones. We could say multiply or multiply by. Just making sure I have all these. And I'm going to move on to finally division. And so for division, I think that there's some important things. First off, we see this symbol here, but it is not often that we're going to use that symbol. Most of the time in this class, we're going to use a fraction bar. So I'm going to have my numerator and my denominator. And it's important to know that the numerator is the top, denominator is the bottom. So for division, words that we have quotient. Let's see. I was trying to think, what else do we have? Sometimes we will hear the ratio of, or we'll hear the phrase per, like miles per hour. That's how far you would go, how many miles you would go in 1 hour. The definition of division is to share equally, or sometimes we could even say evenly. All right, I think that's most of them. I thought as we were going through this, I've thought of a few more, but I think that's a pretty good list that we're going to have. There are some others that we could, add there as well. So I want to make sure that we get through the rest of these terms down here. So when we say the quantity, a lot of times we think like the number of, or how many of an item we have. But in algebra, most of the time, that's going to mean that we're going to introduce parentheses or some type of we say quantity, but we would also say like a quantifier. Like if I want twice as much as this person has, but they've already added something to it, well, I still want twice of it. So I would take however many were originally there, I would add 3, and then I'd multiply it by some amount. Is greater than. Is greater than, well, that's going to be our alligator symbol. I always remember that with our little Pac-Man symbol or alligator, and it always wants to eat the bigger number. So that's how I always remember it, but I'll erase that here and just leave our greater than symbol. Greater than or equal to simply adds an equal sign below it. does not equal. That means that it could not be that value. So it's a equal sign with a line through it. Squared. A square, and we'll do this when we get to exponents, a square means that it's going to be something to the second power, which is very different than a square root, which is sometimes students they say it's like a house or it's a check with a line on it. Absolute value, we're going to take the definition of this in our next section, but absolute value is the distance from 0. 4 is 4 away from 0. Negative 4, the absolute value of negative 4, is also 4 because it's 4 away from 0. When we see is, most often that's going to just be an equal sign. So the total is, or the sum is an equal sign. Is less than, so that's our alligator going the opposite direction. We always read from left to right. Is less than or equal to. Unknown, or a number, most often it's going to be our variable x, but it could be anything. It could be a, it could be c, it could be y, so that's just what we call a variable. Something cubed. Well, cubes are three-dimensional. They're a three-dimensional shape. They have both width, length, and height. So cubed is something to the third power. In a cubed root, well, that's like a square root, except it has a 3 right there in that little check mark spot. So this is kind of the start, the introduction to being able to translate expressions. We need to know what each of these words are for our expressions. The next thing that we'll do is we'll actually get to translating words or phrases into algebra, and then going from algebra back into words, and seeing that there's not always one right answer for translating expressions. In fact, most of the time there's 5 or 6 or more right answers, and it's just kind of choosing and being able to identify which one is written correctly.